Hello and welcome to Jekyll and Hyde, annotate with me. We are now on chapter 2, search for Mr. Hyde. We've already done chapter 1, so if you've not had a look at that video, then I'd encourage you to watch that video first, because we will be referring to some of the ideas that we've already covered in the first video, and a lot of the ideas do relate to one another, so it's important that you sort of follow us along on this journey. You might want to pause the video here so that you can go and grab your copy of the text, a highlighter and a pen. I'd also encourage you to get a notebook where you can make notes of the key quotations, and I'll let you know whenever we come across a key quotation. That way you can use these a bank of key quotations that you should be able to collect by the end of each chapter, and use them in order to revise for your exam or your mocks or assessments. You might want to section the booklet into characters. So, for example, Utterson, a page on Utterson, a page on Enfield, a page on Hyde, etc. Or you might just want to do it chapter by chapter. It's up to you, however you feel works best for yourself. So I will begin the video on chapter 2 now. That evening, Mr. Utterson came home to his bachelor house in sombre spirits, and sat down to dinner without a relish. So remember, he's just visited Enfield, and he's been on his weekly walk with Enfield. Utterson returns from this weekly walk that he usually enjoys with Enfield, feeling really upset because he's found out about Hyde, and he's got his own suspicions about the connection between Jekyll and Hyde. And remember, he's under the impression that Jekyll must be under the influence of blackmail, so Hyde must know something, a deep dark secret about Jekyll, and that's why the two are connected. It was his custom of a Sunday, when this meal was over, to sit close by the fire, a volume of some dry divinity on his reading desk, until the clock of the neighbouring church rang out the hour of 12, when he would go soberly and gratefully to bed. On this night, however, as soon as the cloth was taken away, he took up a candle and went into his business room. There he opened his safe, took from the most private part of it a document endorsed on the envelope as Dr. Jekyll's will, and sat down with a clouded brow to study its contents. So throughout this scene, we see the semantic field and atmosphere of secrecy used. Most of the story's revelations, we'll find out, are made not through the conversations that characters have with one another, but rather through a sequence of letters and documents addressed, sealed and enclosed in safes, so that they need to be put together almost like a puzzle at the end. So we've got this the semantic field of secrecy, or the atmosphere of secrecy, being used here with the quotation, the most private parts, but throughout it we see the same theme continuing as well. The will was holograph, for Mr. Utterson, though he took charge of it now that it was made, had refused to lend the least assistance in the making of it. So that word holograph here means that it's a document written entirely in the handwriting of the person whose signature it carries, so entirely in the handwriting of Jekyll. And we know that Utterson had no part in making the will. Jekyll made it himself and gave it to Utterson as his lawyer. It provided not only that in case of the decease of Henry Jekyll, MD, DCL, LLD, FRS, etc., all his possessions were to pass into the hands of his friend and benefactor, Edward Hyde, but that in case of Dr. Jekyll's disappearance or unexplained absence for any period exceeding 3 calendar months, the said Edward Hyde should step into the said Henry Jekyll's shoes without further delay, and free from any burthen or obligation beyond the payment of a few small sums to the members of the doctor's household. So here we've got some initials or acronyms, and these stand for Doctor of Medicine. So MD is Doctor of Medicine, Doctor of Civil Law, Doctor of Laws, Fellow of the Royal Society. So this emphasizes Jekyll's highly esteemed status, how well educated he is, how reputable he is, and how honourable he comes across to people because of his the level of education that he's received. So again, heightening Jekyll's reputation here. And remember, one of the key themes in the novel is that of reputation. we've got this really key quotation here that you might want to make a note of. Step into the said Henry Jekylls' shoes. So not only is this will worrying in principle, it also contains some ominous language that points us to the eventual split personality that is hidden under the surface. Phrases that direct Hyde to step into Dr. Jekylls' shoes forebode the fact that this is exactly what Hyde is actually going to do. So it's almost like foreshadowing, forewarning that this is exactly what is going to happen later on in the story. This word burthen is an archaic term just for burden. It offended him both as a lawyer and as a lover of the sane and customary sides of life, to whom the fanciful was the immodest. So we've got this quotation here in relation to Utterson. He likes conventions, he likes order, he does not like chaos, he likes things that are within his control. And hitherto it was his ignorance of Mr. Hyde that had swelled his indignation. Now, by a sudden turn, it was his knowledge. So hitherto just means until now, or up until this point. So his ignorance of Mr. Hyde, so him not knowing much about Mr. Hyde, made him more comfortable. Now that he knows more about Mr. Hyde, the fact that obviously he trampled over that girl in chapter 1, how hated he is by everybody who sees him and meets him, he's even more bothered by why Jekyll would have anything to do with this person, and it's just weighing really heavily on him. It was already bad enough when the name was but a name of which he could learn no more. It was worse when it began to be clothed upon with detestable attributes. So Utterson tries his best to professionally explain the cause of Jekyll's will, and must change his theory as new details emerge. But his insistence on rationally explaining Jekyll's disgrace seems not to fit with the unexplainable evil aura of Mr. Hyde. And out of the shifting, insubstantial mists that had so long baffled his eye, there leaped up the sudden, definite presentment of a fiend. So we've got these lots of language here used to associate Hyde to evil. Remember how everybody who meets him hates him, and Utterson hasn't even met him yet, and he seems to feel so much hatred, so many strong feelings of detest towards him. I thought it was madness, he said, as he replaced the obnoxious paper in the safe, and now I begin to fear it is disgrace. With that he blew out his candle, put on a great coat, and set forth in the direction of Cavendish Square, that citadel of medicine, where his friend, the great Dr. Lanyon, had his house and received his crowding patients. If anyone knows, it will be Lanyon, he had thought. So he's going to visit his close friend Lanyon, who is another doctor. A citadel is a fortress usually on high ground above a city, so this is where Dr. Lanyon lives. We also get the impression throughout our meeting of Dr. Lanyon in this scene that he is really very well liked. So we've got quotations like he received his crowding patients, so he's really valued and he's really respected and liked amongst his patients. The solemn butler knew and welcomed him. He was subjected to no stage of delay, but ushered direct from the door to the dining room, where Dr. Lanyon sat alone over his wine. This was a hearty, healthy, dapper, red-faced gentleman, with a shock of hair prematurely white, and a boisterous and decided manner. It's really important to notice the way Dr. Lanyon is described, because there seems to be a symbolic contrast made of the story's two doctors, so Dr. Jekyll and Dr. Lanyon, as two sides of the scientific coin. Here, Lanyon's ruddy complexion and visible popularity with the public shows him as a traditional man of medicine. Jekyll, on the other hand, when we get to meet him, though introduced as a professional man, has strayed off the professional path, according to Lanyon. So in a moment we'll find out that Lanyon says this, but it's important to know these things before they happen sometimes, so that you can make note of them, or you can be mindful of them, or they're better understood. So rumours give him an air of mystery as well. So Jekyll's rumours give him an air of mystery. At sight of Mr. Utterson, he sprang up from his chair and welcomed him with both hands. So he's a really warm, welcoming man. So also a contrast to Utterson, who's quite cold and and distant. The geniality, as was the way of the man, was somewhat theatrical to the eye. However, we've got this oxymoronic term here, so he seems really warm and welcoming, but here it suggests that his eye is theatrical. So once again, we've got the dual nature of the personality hinted at when Lanyon's effusive welcome of Utterson is described as being somewhat theatrical to the eye. This idea that none of the main characters in the book are truly genuine is alluded to throughout this entire novel. So even though Dr. Lanyon is so well liked and so well respected and very popular amongst the public, there's something not quite right with him. There's something fake about him. Remember, hypocrisy and disingenuity is one of the key themes as well within the novel. So we see this running throughout all of the meetings of the main characters as well. But it reposed on genuine feeling, for these two were old friends, old mates, both at school and college, but thorough respecters of themselves and of each other, and what does not always follow, men who thoroughly enjoyed each other's company. So again, we've got Utterson and Enfield in chapter 1 who enjoy each other's company, and here we've got Dr. Lanyon and Utterson who also enjoy each other's companies. They're really close friends as well, but that hint at the theatrical nature of it, the not genuine nature of it, is something that especially grade 8 and 9 candidates should be picking up on. So little subtle hints that things aren't actually quite as they seem. After a little rambling talk, the lawyer led up to the subject which so disagreeably preoccupied his mind. "I suppose, Lanyon," said he, "you and I must be the two oldest friends that Henry Jekyll has." "I wish the friends were younger," chuckled Dr. Lanyon, "but I suppose we are. And what of that? I see little of him now." So Utterson saying we're the closest friends to Jekyll, but Lanyon saying that he doesn't actually see Jekyll anymore. "Indeed," said Utterson, "I thought you had a bond of common interest." "We had," was the reply, "but it is more than 10 years since Henry Jekyll became too fanciful for me. He began to go wrong in mind, and though of course I continue to take an interest in him for old sake's sake, as they say, I see and I have seen devilish little of the man." "Such unscientific balderdash," added the doctor, flushing suddenly purple, "would have estranged Damon Pythias." So the first thing to note is Damon and Pythias, who they are. So Damien and Pythias, is from Greek mythology. They were two inseparable friends. When Pythias was sentenced to death, Damon offered to take his place, but neither wanted to live if it meant that the other had perished. So there's this comparison made to Greek mythology, and we see the use of Greek mythology recurrent throughout the novel. And the importance of it here is that Lanyon is saying the things that Jekyll is getting up to in terms of science and experiments is the kind of thing that would even separate loyal friends, devout friends such as Damon and Pythias. So it emphasizes the point that what Jekyll is doing is beyond forgiveness. So he's clearly getting up to something really, really wrong. So clearly Lanyon's disputes with Jekyll centres around Jekyll's unscientific work, and we're left to speculate its nature. What kind of work must Jekyll be involved in to cause so much offence to his old friend that he loses his temper in Utterson's presence when referring to it? So the key quotations here that you might want to make note of are unscientific balderdash and would have estranged Damien and Pythias, because this will allow you to go into a lot of detail about the language, about the context, so Greek mythology, and really tease out layers of interpretation, which is really important for those of you who are aiming for grade 7s, 8s and 9s. This little spirit of temper was somewhat of a relief to Mr. Utterson. They have only differed on some point of science, he thought. So Utterson doesn't ask any further questions. Again, the theme of reputation and secrecy is presented here. Surely, though, and this is a question that I raised in the last chapter that we analysed, and it's only coming from my own opinion, and it's important to be opinionated, because in the mark scheme, students are really highly awarded. So grade 8s and 9s are awarded so highly because of the offering of interpretations as well as opinions. So this in the mark scheme comes as critical judgment, so offering your own critical judgment. So surely, and this is my critical judgment, surely the very job of a lawyer is to ask questions that result in clear answers. So why is Utterson not seeking a clear answer, but instead resolving in accepting Lanyon's outburst as trivial and not important? So he's kind of like batting it off. It doesn't make sense, somebody as logical and as intelligent as him, and being a lawyer, that he doesn't really get to the bottom of it. He just kind of leaves it and is satisfied with the fact that Lanyon and Jekylls' friendship has ended on the basis of something that's not that they've disputed against at work. But he should be questioning this. He should be questioning why such close friends would part, exactly what happened here, but he doesn't. Again, there's a lot of elements of secrecy and reputation and minding sort of your own business out of respect that's shown here, but that leads to the breaking of bonds. It also leads to people not really getting to the bottom of what's going on, and obviously later on it will lead to the harm of Jekyll as well. And being a man of no scientific passions except in the matter of conveyancing, he even added, it is nothing worse than that. He gave his friend a few seconds to recover his composure and then approached the question he had come to put. Did you ever come across a protégé of his? One Hyde, he asked. Hyde, repeated Lanyon. No, never heard of him since my time. That was the amount of information that the lawyer carried back with him in the great dark bed on which he tossed to and fro until the small hours of the morning began to grow large. It was a night of little ease to his toiling mind, toiling in mere darkness and besieged by questions. So these bits that are highlighted in blue here, these quotations relate to the theme of secrecy. So now Utterson has returned home, and we get the scenes of all of the dreams that he is seeing after speaking to Lanyon, which shows how tormented he is by Hyde. So Utterson's dream once again draws on the theme of secrecy, and you'll be able to pick up on that now when I read it. 6 o'clock struck on the bells of the church that was so conveniently near to Mr. Utterson's dwelling, and still he was digging at the problem. Hitherto it had touched him on the intellectual side alone, but now his imagination also was engaged, or rather enslaved. So he can't stop thinking about what's going on with Jekyll and Hyde. It's almost like he is enslaved by it, so he's a slave to these thoughts. He has no choice but to have these thoughts. And as he lay and tossed in the gross darkness of the night and the curtained room, Mr. Enfield's tale went by before his mind in a scroll of lighted pictures. So he's remembering Mr. Enfield's story about the Hyde trampling over the girl. He would be aware of the great fields of lamp of a nocturnal city. So the setting of his dream is also the city, which is really important, and is something that I'm going to mention a bit later on, the importance of the setting of the city and what that shows. Then of the figure of a man walking swiftly, then of a child running from the doctor's, and then these met, and that human juggernaut trod the child down and passed on regardless of her screams. So we've already analysed the word juggernaut in the last video, but he's having sort of flicking, really fleeting dreams that show him what Enfield described about what happened that night when he saw Hyde trampling over the girl. Or else he would see a room in a rich house where his friend lay asleep, dreaming and smiling at his dreams, and then the door of that room would be opened, the curtains of the bed plucked apart, the sleeper recalled, and lo, there would stand by his side a figure to whom power was given, and even at that dead hour he must rise and do its bidding. The figure in these two phases haunted the lawyer all night, and if at any time he dozed over, it was but to see it glide more stealthily through sleeping hours, or move the more swiftly, and still will the more swiftly, even to dizziness, through wider labyrinths of lamp-lighted city, and at every street corner crush a child and leave her screaming. And still the figure had no face by which he might know it. Even in his dreams it had no face, or one that baffled him and melted before his eyes, and thus it was that there sprang up and grew apace in the lawyer's mind a singularly strong, almost an inordinate curiosity to behold the features of the real Mr. Hyde. So this mysterious figure that he keeps dreaming about has no face for him to recognise, and it moves quickly and stealthily through the houses and labyrinths of the city as if determined to avoid detection. If he could but once set eyes on him, he thought, the mystery would lighten and perhaps roll altogether away, as was the habit of mysterious things when well examined. He might see a reason for his friend's strange preference or bondage, call it which you please, and even for the startling clause of the will. At least it would be a face worth seeing, the face of a man who was without bowels of mercy, a face which had but to show itself to raise up in the mind of the unimpressionable Enfield a spirit of enduring hatred. So the arrival of Mr. Utterson's night terrors is a sign of his inability to cope with what he is hearing on a conscious level. The violence of Hyde's attack and Jekylls' mysterious burden from a pair of nightmares, replaying and replaying in an alternating slideshow. But Utterson, with his rationality, cannot find the link between the two. So he's got these dreams about Jekyll and his will. He's got these dreams about Hyde, almost like a slideshow of alternating different scenes and what has happened from what he's heard from Enfield. But there is no face to this, and he can't seem to find a link between the two characters. From that time forward, Mr. Utterson began to haunt the door in the by-street of shops. In the morning before office hours, at noon when business was plenty, and time scarce, at night under the face of the fogged city moon, by all lights and at all hours of solitude or concourse, the lawyer was to be found on his chosen post. So Mr. Utterson decided that he's going to hang outside that door that him and Enfield walked past to be able to see Hyde, to be able to meet him. We've got the motif or the symbolism of the fog, which is recurrent within the novel. The ever-present fog in the novel is almost like a character in itself. It's constantly stalking the city as it battles with the wind, hides the inhabitants and muffles sound. At times it even enters the houses. This helps not only to create an atmosphere of gloom and misery, but also links with the themes of secrecy and hypocrisy which exists in a city where the secretive vices of respectable men are hidden from the public eye. And then Mr. Utterson thinks to himself, if he be Mr. Hyde, he thought, I shall be Mr. Seek. So these are two key quotations, fog, city, moon, and then this quotation here. In chapter 1, we were told that Utterson respects people's privacy, and even if he sees his brother go down with the devil, he turns the other way. So this makes us question why someone as cold and stoic as him is so invested in uncovering Hyde's flaws. He likes to leave people alone. He likes to leave people to get sort of like, you know, if they're going down with the devil, meaning if they're going downhill, if they're steering towards the wrong direction, he likes to sort of leave it alone, mind his own business. But here he's clearly doing the opposite, and we wonder why he's so invested. And at last his patience was rewarded. It was a fine dry night, frost in the air, the streets as clean as a ballroom floor, the lamps unshaken by any wind, drawing a regular pattern of light and shadow. By 10 o'clock, when the shops were closed, the by-street was very solitary, and in spite of the low growl of London from all around, very silent. Small sounds carried far. Domestic sounds out of the houses were clearly audible on either side of the roadway, and the rumour of the approach of any passenger preceded him by a long time. So when Utterson conceals himself while waiting to surprise Hyde, the description of the quietness of the nocturnal city, in which the slighted sounds are amplified, heightens this tension and sharpens our anticipation of the arrival of Hyde. Mr. Utterson had been some minutes at his post when he was aware of an odd light footstep drawing near. In the course of his nightly patrols he had long grown accustomed to the quaint effect with which the footfalls of a single person, while he is still a great way off, suddenly spring out distinct from the vast hum and clatter of the city. Yet his attention had never before been so sharply and decisively arrested, and it was with a strong superstitious prevision of success that he withdrew into the entry of the court. The steps drew swiftly nearer, and swelled out suddenly louder as they turned at the end of the street. The lawyer, looking forth from the entry, could soon see what manner of man he had to deal with. He was small and very plainly dressed, and the look of him, even at that distance, went somehow strongly against the watcher's inclination. But he made straight for the door, crossing the roadway to save time, and as he came he drew a key from his pocket like one approaching home. Mr. Utterson stepped out and touched him on the shoulder as he passed. "Mr. Hyde, I think." Mr. Hyde shrank back with a hissing intake of the breath. So this quote strengthens the beast-like impressions of Hyde. So you might want to make a note of this, because it's something that you can link a lot of the contextual stuff that we will be discussing in a lot more detail in a later chapter. So, you know, this dehumanization of Hyde is seen throughout this particular chapter and throughout the whole novel. So you might want to make note of that in your notebook. But his fear was only momentary, and though he did not look the lawyer in the face, he answered coolly enough, "That is my name. What do you want?" I see you are going in," returned the lawyer. "I am an old friend of Dr. Jekylls, Mr. Utterson of Gaunt Street. You must have heard my name, and meeting you so conveniently, I thought you might admit me." "You will not find Dr. Jekyll. He is from home," replied Mr. Hyde, blowing in the key. And then suddenly, but still without looking up, "How did you know me?" he asked. "On your side," said Mr. Utterson. "Will you do me a favour?" "With pleasure," replied the other. "What shall it be?" "Will you let me see your face?" asked the lawyer. Mr. Hyde appeared to hesitate, and then, as if upon some sudden reflection, fronted about with an air of defiance, and the pair stared at each other pretty fixedly for a few seconds. "Now I shall know you again," said Mr. Utterson. It may be useful." "Yes," returned Mr. Hyde. "It is as well we have met, and apropos, you should have my address," and he gave a number of a street in Soho. So Mr. Hyde's strange contradictory personality is seen here. He's both grotesque, so disgusting, and polite, which is surprising. But what is perhaps more worrying is how willing and unashamed he is. He's not like a criminal on the run at all, and doesn't shrink much from Utterson's questioning, and in fact reveals the details of his residence without sort of hesitating at all. He seems really comfortable to share these details with Utterson, which makes it very, very unsettling. "Good God," thought Mr. Utterson, "can he too have been thinking of the will?" But he kept his feelings to himself and only grunted in acknowledgment of the address. "And now," said the other, "how did you know me?" "By description," was the reply. "Whose description?" So Hyde's speech is very different from all of the other characters that we meet. He lacks their verbosity, having no time for social chit-chat. His language in this scene is also clipped. He speaks in short, staccato sentences, which are in the form of unnervingly direct questions. "We have common friends," said Mr. Utterson. "Common friends?" echoed Mr. Hyde a little hoarsely. "Who are they?" "Jekyll, for instance," said the lawyer. "He never told you," cried Mr. Hyde with a flush of anger. "I did not think you would have lied. So, Utterson is saying that Hyde and Utterson have a common friend who is Jekyll. But Mr. Hyde seems to get really angry by this, and he's thinking, "Why are you lying? He never told you this information." "Come," said Mr. Utterson, "that is not fitting language." The other snarled aloud in a savage laugh, and the next moment, with extraordinary quickness, he had unlocked the door and disappeared into the house. So Stevenson often uses animalistic imagery to describe Hyde in order to emphasize Hyde's inhumanity. The mention of the doctor's name, so Jekylls Name, seems to produce a visible change in Hyde, a kind of animal reaction like an angry dog almost. The lawyer stood a while when Mr. Hyde had left him, the picture of disquietude. Then he began slowly to mount the street, pausing every step or two and putting his hand to his brow like a man in mental perplexity. So this quotation is really important here. You might want to note this one down in your notebook, as well as these two as well. So snarled into a savage laugh, extraordinary quickness, and a man in mental perplexity. Like Enfield and those that were there for the aftermath of Hyde's attack on the young girl in chapter 1, Utterson too seems to react in the most hyperbolic way, so most over-exaggerated way. Hyde seems to bring out the worst in every single character he meets. The problem he was thus debating as he walked was one of a class that is rarely solved. Mr. Hyde was pale and dwarfish. He gave an impression of deformity without any nameable malformation. He had a displeasing smile. He had borne himself to the lawyer with a sort of murderous mixture of timidity and boldness. So I'm just going to highlight this. And he spoke with a husky whispering and somewhat broken voice. So these are really key quotations for Hyde, and you might want to not note them down. I know this one is long, so you can make it short by saying pale and dwarfish, impression of deformity, without any nameable malformation, displeasing smile. So you can use just short quotations instead of trying to remember this full thing. Okay, it's better actually in the exam to use short quotations. It's a skill that's awarded really highly. It's called judicious quoting, so using quotations with a really good judgment. And then murderous mixture of timidity and boldness. So there's the further description of Hyde that are given in an attempt to dehumanize him. But again, there doesn't seem to be a specific description of him, just vague descriptions. Now, we've already gone through this in chapter 1, so I'm not going to go into too much detail. If you haven't watched the video on chapter 1, it's the same sort of thing, so please can you go back and watch that. But we discussed in great length about the way people react to Hyde and what that shows about hypocrisy. We also discussed how there doesn't seem to be a specific reason why people hate him, which again links to hypocrisy. So if you go back to the video and watch that, that would be great. All these were points against him, but not all of these together could explain the hitherto unknown disgust, loathing and fear with which Mr. Utterson regarded him. So we've got the use the rule of 3, or a triplet here, to emphasize the hatred and disgust Utterson feel towards Hyde, just like the other characters we met in chapter 1. So like I said, every character he meets him argues that it isn't his appearance that causes the most repugnance, but an uncanny influence that he seems to have. There is something more. If I could find a name for it, God bless me, the man seems hardly human. Something troglodytic, shall we say. So this is a really key quotation, and this is a really key quotation that you might want to note as well. So troglodytic means someone who is primitive, like a caveman, unevolved. So another thing to note is that we are never given a detailed description of his face. For example, we're told that he's got a displeasing smile. I want you to consider why you think this is. Is it a mistake by Stevenson, or is it deliberate, do you think? If you think it is deliberate, think why Stevenson is so vague in this respect, okay? And please can you comment down below what your ideas are and what your thoughts are in relation to this question that I've just asked, okay? Because this will really encourage you to be opinionated, to be critical, in order for you to be able to reach the top marks, to have a view on things, to explain why you think things and justify it. Or can it be the old story of Dr. Fell? So Dr. Fell is an unpleasant person who causes feelings of dislike which are difficult to give any obvious reason for. Or is it the mere radiance of a foul soul that thus transpires through and transfigures its clay continent? The last, I think, for, oh, my poor old Harry Jekyll, if ever I read Satan's signature upon a face, it is on that of your new friend. So there are frequent references to Hyde's devil-like qualities. So we've got here the Satan's signature, the metaphor used here to highlight how evil and devilish people think Hyde is. Round the corner from the by-street there was a square of ancient handsome houses, now for the most part decayed from their high estates and let in flats and chambers to all sorts and conditions of men, map engravers, architects, shady lawyers, and the agents of obscure enterprises. One house, however, second from the corner, was still occupied entire, and at the door of this, which wore a great air of wealth and comfort, though it was now plunged in darkness except for the fan-light, Mr. Utterson stopped and knocked. A well-dressed elderly servant opened the door. So Mr. Utterson is on his way to Dr. Jekylls house now. "Is Dr. Jekyll at home, Poole?" asked the lawyer. "I will see, Mr. Utterson," said Poole, admitting the visitor as he spoke, into a large, low-roofed, comfortable hall and paved with flags, warmed after the fashion of a country house by a bright open fire and furnished with costly cabinets of oak. "Will you wait here by the fire, sir, or shall I give you a light in the dining-room?" "Here, thank you," said the lawyer, and he drew near and leaned on the tall fender. This hall, in which he was now left alone, was a pet fancy of his friends the doctors, and Utterson himself was wont to speak of it as the pleasantest room in London. But tonight there was a shudder in his blood. The face of Hyde sat heavy on his memory. He felt, what was rare with him, a nausea and distaste of life, and in the gloom of his spirits he seemed to read a menace in the flickering of the firelight on the polished cabinets and the uneasy starting of the shadow on the roof. So Jekylls' character is symbolized by this elegant property and the hearty hospitality of a fire. So the subtle change in the atmosphere to an ominous one suggests that Jekyll himself is somehow unstable or unsafe. He was ashamed of his relief when Poole presently returned to announce that Dr. Jekyll was gone out. "I saw Mr. Hyde go in by the old dissecting room door, Poole," he said. "Is that right, when Dr. Jekyll is from home?" "Quite right, Mr. Utterson, sir," replied the servant. "Mr. Hyde has a key, so Utterson is saying how he saw Mr. Hyde leave from a different section of the house, a different door in a different area, but part of the same house. And if this is the usual occurrence, if this is something normal that happens, and Poole, the servant, says that yes, it is. Mr. Hyde has a key. "Your master seems to repose a great deal of trust in that young man, Poole," resumed the other musingly. "Yes, sir, he do indeed," said Poole. "We have all orders to obey him." This turn of events put Mr. Hyde in a position of power. It's really important to notice this, and status as well, as if he were an equal of Dr. Jekyll. For Poole, it is as if he has two masters. The bond of Jekyll to Hyde is closer and more powerful than it once seemed. "I do not think I ever met Mr. Hyde," asked Utterson. "Oh dear, no, sir. He never dines here," replied the butler. "Indeed, we see very little of him on this side of the house. He mostly comes and goes by the laboratory. Well, good night, Poole." "Good night, Mr. Utterson," and the lawyer set out homeward with a very heavy heart. "Poor Harry Jekyll," he thought. "My mind misgives me he is in deep waters. He was wild when he was young, a long while ago to be sure, but in the law of God there is no statute of limitations." So a statute of limitations is a law protecting a person from prosecution, from being criminalized or put in jail. It must be that, the ghost of some old sin, the cancer of some concealed disgrace, punishment coming, pede claudo, years after memory has forgotten, and self-love condoned the fault. So pedo claudo is Latin, which means slowly but surely. So he's making excuses for Jekyll, saying it must be still blackmail. He must have got up to something when he was younger, and that's why he's connected to somebody as devilish and evil as Hyde. And the lawyer, scared by the thought, brooded a while on his own past, groping in all the corners of the memory, lest by chance some jack-in-the-box of an old iniquity should leap to light there. His past was fairly blameless. Few men could read the rolls of their life with less apprehension, yet he was humbled to the dust by the many ill things he had done, and raised up again into a sober and fearful gratitude by the many that he had come so near to doing, yet avoided. So Utterson seems to confront the fact that he too has been responsible for certain wrongs in his life, which he has taken great care to hide. So we're left wondering, what is it within all of these main characters' lives that causes them all to feel this way? Utterson is not as blameless and innocent as he seems. This is one of the only occasions that we are given a glimpse into Utterson's more personal reflections, revealing that despite his even-keeled nature and hyper-rationality, even Utterson is not purely good. Note how Utterson continues to think that the connection between Jekyll and Hyde must somehow make rational sense, so he's trying to make rational sense out of the connection between the two men. It also links to the theme of the duality of man, because even Utterson, somebody as calm and collected and professional as Utterson, has a different side to him, a side that he keeps hidden away. So that there's the theme of secrecy and the duality of man, how all of these characters have a different side to them that we've not seen or might never see. This Master Hyde, if he was studied, thought he, must have secrets of his own, black secrets by the look of him, secrets compared to which poor Jekyll's worst would be like sunshine. Things cannot continue as they are. It turns me cold to think of this creature stealing like a thief to Harry's bedside. Poor Harry, what awakening, and the danger of it, for if this Hyde suspects the existence of the will, he may grow impatient to inherit. I must put my shoulder to the wheel, if Jekyll will but let me, he added, if Jekyll will only let me. For once more he saw before his mind's eye as clear as a transparency the strange clauses of the will. So it's interesting here to see how Utterson continues to make allowances for Jekyll's secret, but now he's saying that Hyde must have secrets too. Everybody has secrets. I bet Hyde's are even worse. They're black secrets that will that in comparison will make Jekyll's secrets look like sunshine. So he's more still concerned. So this oxymoron, this juxtaposing language, shows how he's more concerned with Hyde's sins and Hyde's wrongdoings, even though Hyde is nothing to him, than his own friend Jekyll. So again, there's this element of hypocrisy here. So we have finished chapter 2 now. I do realize that it's a really long chapter. There's a lot to go through, but there are some really, really key scenes within this chapter. So it's important that you familiarize yourself with this particular chapter a lot, because it is likely that an extract from this chapter will come up in the exam. Okay, in next week's episode, we will look at chapter 3. Dr. Jekyll was quite at ease. Thank you so much for joining me. If you found these videos useful, then please remember to like, comment and subscribe, and I will see you in the next one. Thank you.